Thank you for that warm introduction. I guess I need to qualify the three citations by the Supreme Court. They were all in dissenting opinions, which kind of takes away the goodness of being cited by the Supreme Court when you're being cited in the dissent. The title of this talk, Truth Overruled, The Future of Marriage and Religious Freedom, it's the title of the book that I recently published. And you may be asking yourselves, am I at the wrong conference? I thought this was a pro-life conference. What is the lunch speaker doing talking about marriage, and particularly talking about the redefinition of marriage, the same-sex marriage case from this past summer? What's the connection? So I want to start by spelling that out a little bit, and then talking about what we can do as a pro-life community to protect religious freedom and to protect the institution of marriage. And the way that I want to start here is simply by saying that the best institutional protection for unborn human life is the family. The best protector for unborn children, it's not the government, it's not the state, it's marriage. And it's a culture that values the virtue of chastity. What we've seen take place for the past 40 or 50 years, ever since the 1960s, since the sexual revolution, is that heterosexuals have made a mess of the virtue of chastity and of the institution of marriage. It's the breakdown of the marriage culture that straight people gave us, that gave us the rise of the hookup culture, that gave us the normalization of premarital sex, the normalization of extramarital sex, of affairs, of adultery, the introduction of no-fault divorce laws, the more than doubling of the rates of divorce, the skyrocketing in terms of the number of children born outside of marriage, and simply the explosion in the rate of abortion. All of those changes follow on a certain cultural understanding of human sexuality and of what marriage is and why marriage matters. Phrases and slogans like consenting adults should do whatever consenting adults want to do. Love makes a family. Love equals love. Marriage should last as long as the love lasts. Those are not phrases that gays and lesbians created within the past decade as they sought to legally redefine marriage. Those were phrases that liberals created in the 60s and in the 70s as a way of describing the sexual revolution that they were starting to propagate in the United States. And so it's only after 50 years of heterosexuals making a mess of the family that we could then have 5 unelected judges redefine what marriage is. The legal redefinition of marriage can only take place after a cultural redefinition of marriage. Now, the legal redefinition of marriage will make that cultural redefinition of marriage so much worse. It'll make it harder to defend the truth about marriage in the public square, in public schools, even in Christian schools. It'll be harder now to bear witness to the truth about marriage, and as a result, it'll be harder for people to live out the truth about marriage. Just one simple way of illustrating this, in several years of doing debates and discussions about marriage, I've never encountered someone who makes an argument both in favor of gay marriage and in favor of chastity. It's not that it's impossible to do that. I mean, I can think of ways in which you could make an argument in favor of gay marriage while also making an argument in favor of chastity. It's just that as a cultural matter, as a worldview marriage, those values don't go together. Conceptually, they don't hang together. And so what the push for the legal redefinition of marriage has done is it's further entrenched in our law and in our culture a certain worldview about human sexuality. And now it's going to be labeling anyone that holds the other worldview, the true worldview. It's going to be labeling them as if they're bigots. More specifically, as if they're racists. In the United States context, that's going to be the comparison that's going to take place. So what I want to do in the time that we have this afternoon is run through 3 major things that I think Americans need to do in response to the Obergefell decision. 3 things that we need to do to help build a bright future for marriage and religious freedom. And that last part is actually going to be multi-pronged. So when we get to the third thing to do, don't be surprised if it ends up having 5 or 6 subsections. All 3 of these lessons, I elaborate them at greater detail in the book, but I came up with them by thinking to the success of the pro-life movement. So there's another reason for having this talk at a pro-life conference. When I was researching and writing my book, I was writing it this time last year. I think most people with a functioning brain saw that there were 5 votes on the Supreme Court to redefine marriage. That even though they shouldn't do it, they were going to do it no matter what. And so I said to myself, all right, if in June we get a bad Supreme Court decision, what should we do? And in thinking through the answer to that question, I said, well, we've been here before. In January of 1973, we got a bad Supreme Court decision. What have we done since then to make it less bad? What have we done since then that has been successful in responding to a bad Supreme Court decision? And here are the lessons that I think we can learn from the pro-life movement, applying it to the marriage movement. First lesson, reject Supreme Court judicial activism. The pro-life movement has never said that Roe v. Wade is the last word about abortion. Many of you, I imagine, travel by bus to the nation's capital every January in the bitter cold. Frequently, it's in the middle of a blizzard, as it was this past year. And you do that not because January is the best time to visit the monuments and to see the cherry blossoms. You do that because that's the anniversary of Roe v. Wade. And you go there to bear witness that the Supreme Court got it wrong and that the Supreme Court doesn't get the last word. That the Supreme Court told a lie about our Constitution, and it told a lie about the dignity of unborn human beings. And that now, 43 years later, we're still bearing witness to the truth about both our Constitution and the sanctity of unborn human life, and we're making progress. The Supreme Court case that was argued last week in front of the Supreme Court dealt with Texas's 20-week abortion law. And what's interesting is that they weren't challenging the 20-week portion, they were only challenging the ambulatory care portion. The portion of the Texas law that says abortion clinics need to be held to the same medical standards as every other surgery center. 20 weeks, that's halfway through pregnancy. Roe v. Wade, with its companion case of Doe v. Bolton, had a 40-week unlimited abortion license. We're not where we should be, which is where no abortions would be legal in the United States, but we're making incremental progress. The Born Alive Infant Protection Act, the partial birth abortion ban, now the 20-week bills, fetal pain capable bills, parental notification bills, waiting periods, ambulatory regulations. We're making a variety of incremental changes, all of which say that the Supreme Court's Roe v. Wade decision is not the last word on this issue. The same thing needs to happen now on the marriage topic. We need to say that the Obergefell decision is judicial activism. There's nothing in the actual text or history or logic or structure of the American Constitution that requires all 50 states to redefine what marriage is. Just as there's nothing in the actual Constitution that says abortion has to be allowed with no limitations whatsoever throughout all 9 months of pregnancy. In the 1970s, it was 7 unelected Supreme Court justices who simply imposed their policy beliefs about abortion on the entire nation. Last summer, it was 5 unelected Supreme Court justices who did that on marriage. So we're even in a slightly better position than the pro-life movement was. Although with Scalia's death, we're in a very precarious situation. And many of the current Supreme Court cases, last week's case about the Texas abortion law, next week's case dealing with the Little Sisters of the Poor, now hang in the balance, which is another way of saying that elections will have consequences. That's lesson number 1. Reject Supreme Court judicial activism. Work to undo a bad Supreme Court ruling. Work to undo it at the policy level. States have been making good pro-life progress. The federal government has made good pro-life progress. We've had good litigators take these cases to the Supreme Court, and they've made incremental progress. We also have to worry about which judges will be sitting on the bench to hear subsequent challenges. And on that, we have to be worried about who's going to be appointing these justices and who is going to be confirming these justices. Second lesson from the pro-life movement: protect religious liberty. After the Roe v. Wade decision, there were activists on the left who said, abortion is now a constitutional right. Abortion is health care like every other aspect of health care. Therefore, every doctor and every nurse and every hospital and every pharmacist and every health insurance plan should be forced to perform an abortion, assist in an abortion, pay for an abortion, dispense abortion-inducing drugs. The activists on the left lost that battle. Common sense pro-life conscience protections have been passed at the federal level, at the state level, and at the local level. And up until the Hobby Lobby case, up until the Hhs mandate, we had a 40-year consensus in the United States that you don't force pro-lifers to perform or pay for abortions. What made the Hhs contraception mandate so outrageous was that this was the first time since Roe v. Wade that we were going to let stand a federal regulation that would actually violate pro-life conscience. One of the reasons why this hadn't happened is that in June of 1973, so 6 months after the Roe v. Wade decision, the Church Amendment was enacted by Congress. The Church Amendment is not named for stone buildings with steeples and stained glass windows. The Church Amendment was named for the Democrat senator from Idaho, Senator Frank Church. This was a bipartisan bill that said the government could not force a pro-life doctor or nurse to perform or assist at an abortion. We buttressed that several years later with the Hyde-Weldon Amendment, which protects conscious rights for all healthcare professionals with respect to abortion. We passed the Hyde Amendment that protected federal taxpayer funding from paying for abortion. We passed the Mexico City policy preventing abortions from being performed on, or taxpayer money from paying for abortions overseas. A variety of ways in which we've protected the conscience rights of pro-lifers. The argument here was that while the Supreme Court has said there's a constitutional right to abortion, that does not mean there's a constitutional duty on any given physician or hospital to perform an abortion, nor is there a constitutional duty on a citizen to pay for an abortion. That's the argument that now needs to be won on the marriage issue. Because pro-lifers won that argument 40 years ago, it's what allows faithful Catholics and Orthodox Jews and evangelical Christians and Latter-day Saints to be doctors and nurses and pharmacists. It's what allows Catholic hospitals to remain open. It's what allows Christian medical schools to stay open. It's what allows pro-lifers to be involved in all of those professions. Had the liberal activists won 40 years ago, every doctor, every nurse, every medical school, every hospital would have been forced to perform abortions, and it would have limited the vocational options of pro-lifers who felt a call to medicine from being able to live out their vocation. So it was vitally important that the pro-life movement won that debate back then, as it is vitally important that they win it with the Little Sisters of the Poor case next week. So too, it's vitally important that we win the religious liberty battle over marriage. Right now, there are people who are saying that anyone who will not help celebrate a same-sex wedding, whether it's a religious school, whether it's a religious charity, whether it's a religious baker, florist, photographer, should be run out of business. The government should deny them a license. The government should deny them accreditation. The government should revoke their nonprofit tax status. The government should take away the accreditation for their school. The government should fine them, penalize them, push them to the margins of society. The argument here is that if you're not in favor of same-sex marriage, you're just like the racists in the 1960s who were against interracial marriage, and the government should treat you the same way that the government treats racists. Obviously, this isn't to deny that racism still exists. This isn't to deny that America still has race problems. It is to say that the way that the government treats racists is radically different than how the government treats pro-lifers. I think the way the government treats racists is entirely appropriate given the moral evil that racism is. The argument now from liberal activists is that if you believe we're created male and female, and that male and female are created for each other in marriage, you are just like the racist. You are committing a moral evil just like racism, and the government should treat you in the same ways. What do I mean by this? Let me give you 3 concrete examples. Massachusetts was the first state to redefine marriage. The state Supreme Court redefined marriage in that state. And 2 years later, the state was shutting down Boston Catholic Charity Adoption Agencies. Catholic Charity Adoption Agency says, we have a divine mandate to take care of widows and orphans. We've been taking care of orphans before the state of Massachusetts even existed. The church was taking care of the least among us long before Western nation states came into existence. They also said we have social science that show children do best with a mom and a dad. All we're asking for is the freedom to continue running our adoption agency without any government mandates that we do same-sex adoptions. The state of Massachusetts replied, says, we now have marriage equality. Our state Supreme Court redefined marriage. We also have a non-discrimination ordinance that says you can't discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation. Unless you treat every married same-sex couple in the same way as you treat married moms and dads, you're violating our non-discrimination ordinance, and we won't give you an adoption license unless you pledge not to engage in illegal discrimination. Because it's illegal to run an adoption agency without an adoption license, Catholic Charities in Boston was forced to shut down. Now, this does nothing to help orphan children find homes. All this does is score a point for political correctness. What took place in Boston was that certain activists on the left said it was more important that we enforce a new orthodoxy on human sexuality, that 2 moms or 2 dads is the same thing as a married mom and dad, than it is that we allow the Catholic Church to continue finding homes for these children. What's particularly upsetting about this is that the Catholic Church had a remarkable track record at finding homes for the hardest to place kids. Everyone wants to adopt the newborn baby. They're cute, they're cuddly, they're fun. Very few families want to adopt a 9-year-old boy with behavioral problems. So whether you're a skeptic or a believer, you can chalk it up either to Catholic guilt or to grace. One way or the other, Catholic Charities Adoption Agency was able to get more families to be more generous, to open up their hearts and their homes to more children than other agencies were able to do. And all the adoption agency asked for was the freedom to continue doing it. They said, look, the government adoption agency is free to do same-sex adoptions. The secular humanist adoption agency is free to do same-sex adoptions. We just want to be free to find children homes with moms and dads. And the state said no. Second example. During oral arguments, Justice Alito asked the Solicitor General of the United States, what's going to happen to Christian schools that teach marriage is the union of a man and a woman? Are they going to be treated the way that Bob Jones University was treated? In mentioning Bob Jones University, Alito was alluding to the fact that the IRS revoked the nonprofit tax status of Bob Jones University. Bob Jones University was a Christian school that had a policy against interracial dating. And the IRS said that runs afoul of racial equality. We're not giving you a nonprofit tax status if you don't respect racial equality. They appealed that decision, citing religious liberty concerns. It went up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, no, you don't have a religious liberty right to be a racist, to be a bigot. The question here from Alito was, is the same thing now going to happen to Orthodox Jews, Roman Catholics, evangelicals, Latter-day Saints, people of many faith traditions who believe we're created male and female, and that male and female are created for each other? I was in the courtroom that morning, and his response was a little, it was stunning. It was kind of chilling, because he didn't say, oh, of course we do that. Jews and Catholics and evangelicals and Mormons, people who believe we're created male and female, they're nothing like racists, and we would never treat them like racists. He could have said that. He didn't say that. What he said was, I don't deny it, Justice Alito. That's going to be an issue. I don't deny it. It's going to be an issue. So someone somewhere had told him, don't even make a promise that we won't do this, perhaps because they think that it might be in their best interest to do it at a certain point. Maybe within the next 10 months, the last 10 months of President Obama's term, maybe in the next 8 years of a President Clinton's administration, who knows? But at some point, they wanted to have this card to play it should the opportunity arise. And so it's no surprise that 2 days after the Supreme Court announced its marriage decision, the religion columnist for the New York Times wrote an op-ed for Time magazine titled, "Now's the Time to End Nonprofit Tax Status to Religious Schools." Now, you're in Ohio, so you know in the neighboring state of Michigan, there's Hillsdale College. It's one of 3 colleges or universities that doesn't take government funding. But it still is a nonprofit tax-exempt institution. The fact that it's one of 3 that doesn't take government funding shows you how difficult it is, that the government has rigged the game of higher education to make it nearly impossible to run a university without receiving government funding. Right? So they overtax us on the one hand to then give us government subsidized loans or grants or contracts on the other hand, to make us dependent on government funding so then they can regulate us. Hillsdale's found a way of avoiding it, but even they wouldn't be safe from this if they lost their nonprofit tax status. Imagine what would happen if all of the Catholic schools in the state of Ohio had to start paying property taxes, had to start paying income taxes on all of the charitable contributions that were made to those schools. You can see how the government has a variety of mechanisms to force people who have beliefs that the government doesn't like to change those beliefs. And so whether it's licensing like the adoption agency, or whether it's going to be something like nonprofit tax status or government funding in the case of education, that's going to be one of the next frontiers. This is particularly important because one of the reasons why we have parochial schools in the first place is to opt out of the indoctrination that takes place in the government-run public schools. So the more difficult the state makes it for families to educate their children in accordance with their beliefs rather than the state's beliefs, the harder the time it'll be for all of you to pass on the truth to your children and your grandchildren. The more difficult they make it for your schools to remain in business, the more difficult of a job you'll have of teaching your children and grandchildren the truth. Let me mention the third example here. These are the wedding professionals. By now, I imagine you've heard the stories of the bakers, the florists, the photographers, people of faith who have no problem serving gay and lesbian customers, but simply can't help celebrate the same-sex wedding. One of the best-known cases involves a 71-year-old evangelical Christian grandmother in the state of Washington, Barronelle Stutzman. She's had gay employees work for her in her floral studio. She has no problem employing gay people. She was selling flowers to a particular gay couple for a decade. She had no problem selling them happy birthday flowers, get well soon flowers. It was only after Washington State redefined marriage that they were going to get married, and they said to her, "Can you do all of the wedding flowers for our same-sex wedding?" And she sat down with one of them. She said, "Roger, you know how much I love you guys, but I can't do a same-sex wedding. I believe that my artistic gifts and talents are gifts from God, and I can't use those gifts that he's blessed me with to help celebrate what I believe would be a lie about his institution of marriage." She views her vocation as a stewardship, and so she can't use that stewardship, she can't deploy it, exercise it in a way that would undermine the purpose of it in the first place, which is to serve and bring glory to God. So she was sued by the state attorney general. She is still in court. She's lost all of her appeals so far. And just last week, the state Supreme Court announced that it would be reviewing her case. So she's gone all the way up to the state Supreme Court, and she's lost every legal proceeding so far. Just to give you an idea, she has been sued in both her professional and her personal capacity. So what's at risk here is not just her business, but also her home. It's both her livelihood and her life, to put it that way. The reason I mention that is in the neighboring state of Oregon, a young evangelical family, Aaron and Melissa Klein, were sued by a same-sex couple they didn't bake a same-sex wedding cake for, and they were forced to pay $135,000 in fines for the emotional and psychological harm that they caused. Aaron and Melissa, the husband-wife team, were running a bakery called Sweet Cakes by Melissa. They were supporting their 4 small children. As a result of this lawsuit, they had to pay the $135 fine. They've also been forced to shut down their bakery. And Aaron is now supporting his wife and 4 small children by being a trash collector. So you can see how these laws threaten people's lives, their livelihood. This is why it's vitally important that good religious liberty protections are enacted. This is why it's important that the principle be established that while the Supreme Court has said state governments have to recognize same-sex couples as marriages, this doesn't mean charities or schools or wedding professionals have a duty to help celebrate those weddings or recognize those marriages. That while the government now needs to recognize them, civil society should be free to continue believing what they've always believed about marriage. Right? So the Catholic Charity Option Agency should be free to do what it's always been doing about marriage. The Catholic school should be free to teach what it's always taught about marriage. The baker, the florist, the photographer should be free to continue doing weddings as they've always done weddings. This doesn't take anything away from anyone. It's not as if in the state of Washington, conservative evangelicals have a monopoly on cake baking or floral arrangements. There are plenty of other bakers and florists who support same-sex marriage and who were interested in making money. So in a free market economy, in a free society, in a society that values pluralism and diversity and tolerance, we would say if you're in favor of same-sex marriage, bake the same-sex wedding cake. If you're not in favor of it, the government shouldn't force you. And if you're the same-sex couple, go to a different baker, go to a different florist, give those people your business, but don't sue them. Part of diversity and tolerance and pluralism is that we say, let Notre Dame be authentically Catholic, let Wheaton be authentically evangelical, let Brigham Young University be authentically Mormon, and let Princeton, my alma mater, be authentically liberal, authentically secular, right? The job here isn't to make them all the same. It's to say, let 1,000 flowers bloom, and then let the market sort these things out. If people want authentic Catholic education, they'll go to Notre Dame, or maybe some other Catholic school. I say that as someone with a PhD from Notre Dame. If they want an authentically secular liberal education, they'll go to Princeton. If they want an authentically Mormon education, they'll go to BYU. That's America at her best. It's not that we all become the same, it's that we allow diversity and pluralism to take place. That's why freedom is so important. That's why on this issue, religious freedom in particular will be important. Let me move to this third lesson from the pro-life movement. And this is the one with multi-prongs. And I'm going to get through as many as I can in the time that I have left. So I'm not going to tell you how many numbers there will be because I'm just going to stop once we're at time. And we're going to save time for your questions and answers. So as you have those note cards, you can be thinking about what you would like to ask about. But the third lesson from the pro-life movement is that we actually have to make the argument for the truth. The pro-life movement didn't just say, Roe v. Wade is wrong, give us our religious liberty, and that's all we want. The pro-life movement said, Roe v. Wade is wrong, protect our rights not to be complicit in abortion, and let us bear witness to the truth about unborn human life. Let us make the case for life in the public square. It wasn't simply enough to say the court got it wrong, now protect our right to be free in the confines of our little communities. It was also, this is a public truth. The right to life is a public truth that we are going to defend in the public square. The same is true about marriage. The court has overruled the truth about marriage. That's where the title Truth Overruled comes from. But it hasn't changed the truth. The truth about marriage, the truth about human nature remains what it always has been, and it's now our job to bear witness to that truth. This is particularly important precisely because of the religious liberty aspects. And what I mean by that is the following. My average classmate at Princeton was a secular, liberal, pro-choice individual. They disagreed with me about abortion, but they at least understood why I believed what I believed about abortion. They could say, yes, I think Ryan's wrong about abortion, but I see why he's pro-life. I understand why he thinks the unborn child in the womb has a right to life. And as a result, they could say, and I see why the government shouldn't be coercing him into violating that belief. So when you understand the underlying conviction and what motivates someone to hold that conviction, you're much more likely to say, well, I shouldn't force them to violate that conviction. Now, on the marriage issue, despite the best of my efforts, my average classmate at Princeton still does not understand why I believe what I believe. The average secular liberal American thinks the Westboro Baptist Church speaks for everyone in this room today. And if you're not familiar with the Westboro Baptist Church, this is, in the technical sense of heresy, this is a heretical group that holds up signs at funerals that say, God hates fags. And the reason I say they're a heretical group in the technical sense of that term is that God hates no one. So they're engaged in formal heresy when they say this. Now, if you were a secular liberal, you've never gone to church, you've never read the Bible, and all you know about Christians is the Westboro Baptist Church sign, how likely would you be to protect their religious freedom? As a cultural matter, your response is going to be, these people are crazy, these people are evil, and these people need to be stopped. You're going to view the Westboro Baptist Church much more like the racists than like the pro-lifers. So the challenge for this third lesson from the pro-life movement is that we have to make the public argument not just for its own sake, bearing witness to the truth about marriage for its own sake, but even if we're to achieve the second strategy here, the protecting our freedom, we won't even be able to protect our freedom to live in accordance with the truth unless we share the truth with our neighbors. So let me run through a couple of steps of what this would look like. First, we need to be able to make a secular argument for marriage. The first book that I wrote with co-authors Sharif Girgis and Robert George was a secular philosophical defense of marriage. The title of the book was What is Marriage? Man and Woman, a Defense. Sharif was a classmate of mine at Princeton. Robbie was one of our professors. And what we learned from the pro-life movement was that pro-lifers have had success because they show that faith and reason go together on the issue of the right to life. There's no conflict between science and theology. There's no conflict between what the best of human reason and the best of revelation show on the right to life. We need to be able to do the same thing on the marriage issue. So in this new book, Truth Overruled, the first several chapters are just devoted at making a secular, philosophical, and social science argument defending the truth about marriage. It's meant to equip ordinary people in how to have that discussion with your neighbors, with your classmates, with your teammates, with your coworkers. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but you could ask yourself this. How equipped do you think you are right now to make a non-religious argument in defense of the truth about marriage? If you're not as equipped to make that argument as you are to make the pro-life argument, there's some homework to be done. We're going to have to do what the pro-life movement did 40 years ago. The pro-life movement learned how to make a secular argument to defend life. And we now have all of these training modules, like this weekend, where we teach our children how to make the case for life. The same thing will have to happen on the marriage issue. This will involve, so the next subpart, also learning the social science on this issue. So both the philosophy of marriage, also the social science. The number of times in which I've seen newspapers with headlines that say, same-sex parents no different than moms and dads, or headlines that say lesbian parents are even better than moms and dads. That has been one of the ways that the cultural left worked to redefine marriage, to say there's no difference between two moms, two dads, a married mom and dad. The best social science, the most recent social science, shows that that's simply not true. That prior to the debate about same-sex marriage, we had 40 years of social science that looked at family structure in general and found that the best place for a child to be raised was by their married biological mother and father. Then the question of same-sex marriage came up. There was a lot of politicized science. There was a lot of science that didn't use large, random, representative samples. And it came to the conclusion that two moms or two dads just as good, if not better, than a mom and a dad. The latest science uses large, random, representative samples, and it shows that that prior 40-year consensus still holds up. The best place for a child is with their married biological mother and father, and for 3 reasons. Biology matters, gender matters, and stability matters. Having a double biological connection helps with the child. Our bodies matter. We're not just kind of ghosts and machines. We're not angels. We're actually incarnate beings. And having that double biological connection matters. Gender matters. There's no such thing as parenting. There's mothering and there's fathering. Men and women aren't interchangeable. Moms and dads aren't replaceable. Children do best with both. And then stability matters. This is one reason why marriage is better than cohabitation, better than divorce and remarriage. Having that stable family unit matters. Third subpart here, personal stories. One of the things that the pro-life movement learned was that we wasn't enough just to talk about the science of embryology or the philosophy of human rights. We also needed to have better spokespeople, and we had to have personal stories. So in particular, people like Silent No More and Feminists for Life. Someone like Lila Rose. It's very hard to say Lila Rose is a self-hating, anti-woman, war on women activist. Right? We have articulate, thoughtful young women talking about how abortion harms both women and unborn children. We can do the same thing on the marriage issue. So in the 7th chapter of the book, I look at some of the testimonies from children of same-sex couples and from gay and lesbian people themselves who are against gay marriage. It's very hard to deny someone's story. You can ignore science, you can ignore philosophy. It's very hard to ignore testimony. And so what I show there is there's several now middle-aged adults who were raised by 2 moms. One of them's Heather Barwick. She's probably now in her late 30s, early 40s. She was in favor of same-sex marriage as a 20-year-old. She said, I wanted my 2 moms to have the legal right to be married like every other family. She said it was only after she got married and she saw her husband fathering their children that she was able to articulate what she had missed out on by not having a father. When she saw her husband fathering her children, she saw and was able to name what her 2 moms, while great mothers, weren't able to provide. And so she writes that she still loves her 2 moms, but the best 2 moms in the world can't replace a missing dad. And she coined a phrase that's been helpful for my own thinking about this issue. She says, redefining marriage creates an institution for missing parents. That with single parenting, with divorce parenting, no one incentivizes it. No one says, when I grow up, I want to be a single mom. No one says, when I grow up, I want to be a divorced dad. We don't have public policy encouraging those outcomes. We recognize sometimes that is the best of a bad situation. We're fallen creatures. We live in a fallen world, and you can't always have an ideal, but we didn't change the ideal. She says, with same-sex marriage, we now have an institution for missing parents because we now have changed the ideal. We've said that the ideal, 2 moms, 2 dads, a mom and a dad, it's all the same. And she says this then denies the reality to those children who experience a lack. The child in the single-parent home can say, Mom, I miss Dad. The child of the divorce family can say, the divorce has been hard on me. I miss whatever parents miss. The child in the same-sex family can't say that, is not given the freedom to say that. And in fact, some of the most recent amicus briefs filed on the case showed that children, when they expressed these desires for the missing father and the missing mother, were told by therapists that they were being homophobic. That the problem wasn't with the family structure, the problem was with them. That they had 2 married moms or 2 married dads, and if they felt the lack of a missing parent, it was because they had internalized homophobia. We need to be sharing these stories. We also have to share the story of someone like Doug Mainwaring, a gay man against gay marriage. He's argued that just because he's sexually attracted to other men is no reason to be denying a child of a mother. Those are the sorts of arguments, the sorts of stories that we can be using. I have 5 minutes left, so let me move through more quickly with these last couple of points. Point 4 is that the pro-life movement created direct ministries to people in crisis pregnancies. So think about Project Rachel's Vineyard. Think about the crisis pregnancy centers. Think about the Sisters of Life. And now ask yourself, what will the functional equivalent look like for people with same-sex attractions? This is where a group like Courage comes in. Courage is the Catholic group that ministers to people with same-sex attractions. Interestingly enough, Justice Scalia's son, Father Paul Scalia, who preached his funeral mass, he was the chaplain of Courage for his diocese before his most recent promotion. The question is going to be, if we're not in favor of same-sex marriage, what are we in favor of for people with same-sex attractions? And how are we helping them live out their vocations? And this can't simply be outsourced to a group like Courage. So it's important that you have a group like Courage. It's also important that you do something. There's a universal human desire for friendship, for companionship. We all have a need for relationships that matter. So when Thanksgiving comes around, when Christmas comes around, are you inviting a same-sex attracted colleague or friend or member of your church who isn't married and doesn't have a family of his or her own? Are you inviting them into your family to share Thanksgiving dinner or Christmas dinner? Are you having them be big brother or big sister, godfather or godmother to your children if they're not going to be married and have children of their own? Are there ways in which we can show that there are other forms of community that matter, that are important, that are meaningful, without having to redefine marriage? One of the most embarrassing parts of Justice Kennedy's majority opinion was when he said, if we don't redefine marriage, there'll be people who will be lonely. That there'll be people who will call out in need and they'll be all alone. This is now an opportunity for people who believe the truth about marriage to show that Justice Kennedy is wrong. That we can meet people's real needs without redefining what marriage is. Let me close with two lessons from two popes. As every good Catholic should, I'm going to close by papal authority. First, John Paul II. John Paul II diagnosed the problem of the 20th century as a problem of anthropology. Anthropology being a big word for man and the study of man. What he was looking at, he saw the two world wars, he saw the Holocaust, the totalitarian regimes, he saw the abortion scandal. He saw all of these things as denying the dignity of the human person. The church in the 21st century is in a different place than the church in prior eras. For the early church, heresies dealt with the nature of God. It was about Trinitarian theology, about Christology, the nature of Christ, the nature of the triune God. That's where all of the interesting theological work was taking place. For the church of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, regardless of which side of that line you fall on, it was about justification, sanctification, ecclesiology. Today's debates aren't primarily about the nature of God, the nature of the church, the nature of salvation. They're about the nature of man. What's at stake are three central truths revealed right at the beginning of the book of Genesis, that we're created in the image and likeness of God, that we're created male and female, and that male and female are created for each other. Those are the truths that the 21st century community needs to defend. Those are the heresies that we need to respond to when people deny those three truths. And we're going to need this intellectual defense, this cultural defense, at both the philosophical and the theological level. We need philosophers and theologians. We need scientists, social scientists, psychologists, psychiatrists, demographers. We need artists and musicians. We need pastors and priests. We need people from every walk of life, whatever your particular vocation is, to help defend these truths. And whether it's in film or in music and TV and drama, whether it's going to be an academic book, if you're a philosopher like me, write the type of books I write. If your vocation is some other domain, ask yourself how you can use your gifts and talents to help defend these truths. These are the front lines of our intellectual challenges. And then let me close with an insight from Pope Benedict. Pope Benedict is a world-class intellectual, world-class theologian. He wanted nothing more than just to remain a university professor. But he said yes when John Paul asked him to be the head of the CDF. Then he said yes when the College of Cardinals asked him to be Pope. What he wanted to do, though, was to continue researching and writing intellectual books about theology. And so it's all the more impressive that one of the consistent themes of his time as a priest, as a bishop, and as the Pope was that it's not the arguments of the philosophers and the theologians that win converts, it's the lives of the saints. So I want to close my remarks with where I began. Had heterosexuals not made a mess of marriage and the family for the past 50 years, we would have never been in a situation in which 5 unelected judges could redefine marriage. It's only after we failed to live out the truth about marriage that monogamy doesn't matter, that permanence doesn't matter, that exclusivity doesn't matter, that 5 judges could say sexual complementarity doesn't matter, that male-female doesn't matter either. And so in the long term, what's going to be the best defense of marriage and what's going to be the best defense of life? It's going to be holiness. Benedict says it's the beauty of the church, the beauty of the artists of the church, and the holiness, the sanctity of her saints. And by saints, he's not meaning capital S canonized saints that are on the calendar and get a feast day. He means all of the people in this room. The universal vocation to holiness, living out the truth about marriage in our own lives, in our own state, whatever state in life we find ourselves, bearing witness to the truth, not in our words, but in our actions. So one of the most moving parts of Justice Scalia's funeral homily was when he said that Dad gave us the great gift of family, and how he and his 8 brothers and sisters were appreciating it in that moment. And you think about Justice Scalia, he had 9 children, 20-some grandchildren. He says that, his wife Maureen deserved all of the credit for this. That was a witness, and possibly his greatest defense of marriage wasn't the 2 stinging dissents that Scalia wrote on the 2 marriage cases, but it was simply living out the truth and then passing on the truth to his kids and his grandkids. Thank you. Okay, perfect.
If some of that went over your head and you'd like to hear it again, or maybe it is being downloaded. I'm told because so many people are tweeting and on Facebook that it's actually taking longer to download than we thought. So some of these programs may not be on until after dinner, but they are doing a great job at every one of our presenters getting them right up and on the website. So that will be available for you. First question, I just love the first question for you, is if you were nominated to replace Justice Scalia, would you accept?
Well, I never went to law school, so I don't even think I would be eligible to accept. I can? You don't need to be a lawyer? Then maybe in that case, that would be better if we had a non-lawyer in the Supreme Court.
Someone mentioned the impact that the March for Life has had on the pro-life movement. Do you think that a march would be effective in dealing with the same-sex marriage issue?
Yeah, I think any public witness. I think what's been so powerful about the March for Life, for me as someone who has attended, was the undeniable reality that you're not alone. I think one of the techniques that the left has used on both the life issue and the marriage issue was to say that you are backwards, you belong on the wrong side of history, you have this false worldview, and you're all alone in holding it. And I think one of the great things that the March for Life does is it shows the strength in numbers, especially when you see how many young people are there. People said 40 years ago, well, pro-lifers are on the wrong side of history, and 40 years from now, the last pro-lifers will be in nursing homes and inside of the Vatican. And when you look at the March for Life, you can see that that prophetic word was false. It's what the liberals wanted to believe would be the truth, and it's not the truth. The majority of Americans now identify as pro-life, and my generation is more pro-life than my parents' generation, precisely because of the work that my parents' generation did. And so there's no reason why, if you're a millennial right now and you know the public opinion polls and you know that the majority of your classmates disagree with you, that's where the pro-lifers were a generation or 2 ago. That's where your parents and your grandparents were after the Roe v. Wade decision. And the reason why it's easy today to be a millennial and to be pro-life is because of the work that your parents and your grandparents did. There's no reason why you can't do that work now on the marriage issue so that your children and your grandchildren will inherit a movement that you helped create.
Wow. Next one's kind of twofold because there are a lot of pastors and priests out there that have to deal with people who struggle with homosexuality. So what recommendations would you give to them as pastors or priests and just in terms of their role as a pastor, what legality may be in, and maybe, I don't know if it's your expertise or not, but what would you say to someone like me who has a son that struggles with homosexual tendencies?
Sure. Great question, and I am going to say at the beginning here that this is going beyond my area of expertise. So I kind of do the policy of marriage, the philosophy of marriage. I'm not a theologian, I'm not a pastor, I don't do pastoral care or therapy. But I would say, I mean, there are certain responses that I think are universal and that are within my pay grade of answering. And I think one is that you need to express a true sense of love. I think many people have been turned off from the church because they actually think the Westboro Baptist Church speaks for us. And it's that middle word, hates, and it's God hates. And then it's the slang, the slur at the end, and how we talk about people with same-sex attraction. All three words of the Westboro Baptist Church undermine the Christian witness. So one of the starting points is God loves you, and I love you. If that is the message that your son hears, he's already going to be more receptive to whatever next comes out of your mouth. I think then you do want to talk to someone like Father Scalia, like a group like Courage, on what are actually the effective pastoral approaches to someone who struggles with same-sex attractions. But I would say that there's no difference here than any other type of struggle that we have. St. Augustine says the entire Christian life is about rightly ordering our loves, and that we all have misplaced desires. We all have attractions that aren't oriented towards the good, the true, and the beautiful, and that the moral life is about, little by little, rightly ordering our loves. And so someone with same-sex attraction shouldn't feel any different than any other member of the community, because we all have our struggles, whatever we label them, however we publicly or privately acknowledge them. And so we need to have a place in which people can find the support they need. And that's what I mentioned in terms of a group like Courage, formal group, but also the friendship, the companionship, the meaningful relationships. If we're not in favor of same-sex marriage, we need to help create other avenues for people, whether it's Thanksgiving or Christmas, big brother, little brother, godfather, godmother, things like that.
So even how we respond to people on Facebook and others, a loving response goes a long, long way at keeping the door open. Just piggyback on that just for a moment, because someone followed that with a similar question on the what's effective treatment, psychotherapy, where would you help send someone for help?
Grade,
okay. Yeah. Yeah, stop at the comedy table and I'll try to help you with do that. See what else we say. Okay, here's a good one. Well, they're all good. We got like 30 questions here. You say that a child raised by 2 females or 2 males misses out on a stable family unit. There's a benefit. So what do we do for foster kids that are waiting for someone to adopt them? Would it not be better for them to be adopted by 2 people of the same sex than to be left in the system?
Yeah. Great question. If those were the 2 options, languishing in the foster care system or being adopted by the same-sex couple, my guess is that all things being equal, the same-sex couple is probably going to be better than bouncing around in the foster care system. I think it's a lack of imagination if we think that those are the only 2 options. The third option here is that we should all be asking ourselves, can we be more generous when it comes to adoption? Both that would be a pro-life witness, so if someone's facing an unplanned pregnancy, knowing that there's a loving home that's ready to welcome a child into their house, but also it would help eliminate this false binary choice. In the policy debates today, what we're seeing take place, it's not just Boston Catholic Charities, it's also happened in Illinois and in San Francisco and in Washington, D.C., where I live. So what's happening right now is it's not the choice between foster care or same-sex adoption. It's will we even allow faith-based adoption agencies that are trying to find homes with married moms and dads to continue doing that work? And that's where I would say that the religious liberty portion of this argument is going to be vitally important, that we can keep our charities open, serving the least of these, and we can keep our schools open, teaching the truth about these issues.
Just handed this one, but it seems to be a legal issue. Aren't the excessive fines bills of attainder, the 6th Amendment? I have no clue what that means, but does that make sense to you? You understand
I think
the question?
so. I don't think it raises a legal challenge there because these are prospective laws. So in the sense that a state passes a law saying if you discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation, These will be the various categories of fines based upon our fact-finding mission to see how much damage you caused. So in Oregon, they had a law that says you can't discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation. They then said believing that marriage is the union of a man and a woman is, by definition, discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, even though the businesses had no problem employing gay people or serving gay people. Their only objection was to the wedding. They then looked in to see what sort of damages not baking that cake had caused. The attorneys for the same-sex couple had listed about 130 conditions, and you can find this on the internet. If you just Google the case, you'll see their legal complaint, and then they said that it merits this much compensation, and the number they came up with was $135,000. Wow. So unfortunately, I don't actually think there's anything explicitly unconstitutional. What's interesting about this case is that some reporters were looking at this, and they saw that the gay rights group of Oregon and the county administrator, whose agency was both prosecuting the case and adjudicating the case, this person got to be both judge and prosecutor, that there was collusion. Maybe collusion is too strong of a legal term, but there was communication between them. And it looked like there was some coordination on this case. And that commissioner of the Bureau of Labor and Industries is now running for a statewide office. So it looked like this was a way of creating a name for himself.
Besides the flower and cake business, what about the rest of the business owners represented here? On what basis can we deny anyone in terms of race, economy, others? Are there any legal precedents for that?
So I don't know what the Ohio public accommodation statutes are, but the Civil Rights Act of '64, which is a federal law, says that you can't discriminate on the basis of race or on sex, nationality, ethnic background, religion, things like that. And then it lists a variety of contexts: employment, housing, public accommodations, things like that. What's most interesting right now is that the Obama administration is reinterpreting sex to mean gender identity. So in the 1972, when they passed Title IX of the Civil Rights Act, this was meant to protect girls' and women's equal access to higher education and to education in general. It was to make sure that girls were able to get the same educational opportunities that boys were given, that women were able to have the same college opportunities that men were given. Now the Obama administration is reinterpreting that to say that boys who identify as girls need to have unfettered access to the girls' bathroom, the girls' locker room, the girls' shower facilities, and the girls' sports teams. They're reinterpreting discrimination on the basis of sex to mean gender identity, directly to undermine the equal rights and the privacy rights of girls and women in schools. That's what I would keep an eye on in this area, is what's happening, particularly here in Ohio. Because I know in Illinois, there was a public school district that said, we're going to create a reasonable accommodation. They had a transgender student. They said it was a boy who was identifying as a girl. They're saying, look, we're not going to force you to use the boys' locker room. We're going to allow you to use the girls' locker room, but we're going to set up a privacy curtain. And we're going to ask that you go behind the curtain and change. That way, we can protect the privacy interests of the girls in the locker room and accommodate your interest here. They were told by the Federal Department of Education that they were denying that student her civil rights. That unless they treated that student like every other girl student, that student didn't have equality under Title IX of the Civil Rights Act. That's where things are currently standing with the federal government.
We have about a minute and a half book, and again, there will be some copies of it, but reading your bio, you were just commissioned to write or co-author a book. You want to take the last minute to tell us about that?
So the project that I'm currently working on is going to be a book with Oxford University Press titled Debating Religious Liberty, Bigotry, and Tolerance. And the idea here is it's going to be a co-authored point-counterpoint book with a philosophy professor at Wayne State University. He himself is in a same-sex relationship. He's probably against us on the religious liberty issue, so it's going to be a point-counterpoint book. And Sharif Gerges and I are doing the pro-religious liberty, pro-tolerance, anti-bigotry part. He's going to do an anti-religious liberty, anti-bigotry, pro-tolerance portion. It's going to be a back and forth, because that's where we see a lot of these issues heading. A lot of these issues are heading into what is the status of someone who believes we're created male and female, and that male and female are created for each other. Is that a bigoted view? Is that a view that should be tolerated? Is that a reasonable review that deserves conscience protection, religious liberty protections? That probably won't be out for another year, but some of the preliminary thoughts on these issues are in the book that should be for sale at the bookstore. If not, it's $10 on Amazon. It's Truth Overruled, The Future of Marriage and Religious Freedom. Thank you.